Here they are, soldiers of the Russian army. Putin is bringing mercenaries from Africa to the front lines in Ukraine.
We need to help them move into the combat zone.
From Nepal.
I'm from Nepal.
And other least prosperous countries. In Cuba, I could only make $6 a month, but here I was promised $2,000.
A gathering of people very distant from the military sphere is now part of the Russian army. Newly minted international soldiers from Africa, Asia and Latin America mixed with convicts, cannibals, pedophiles and homicidal maniacs. The Russian army takes everyone indiscriminately. Everyone who can be bought cheap or got for free is betting on quantity rather than quality. Why are commanders shocked by such reinforcements? And where else is the Russian Federation buying its cannon fodder? Watch this special report, Soldiers at Retail. Who is making Putin's army? The Russian army is desperately short of men. The losses at the front are enormous. On average, 1,500 soldiers are killed or seriously wounded every day. The Kremlin urgently needs to bring in new people to replace the dead. There are not enough contractors for this and not enough people willing to die for money. Putin does not want to carry out mass mobilization, so he found a way out that would seem cheap and easy to lure the inhabitants of the poorest countries of the world with money. Recruitment is in full swing in Africa, Somalia, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone. Russian agents promise citizens of these countries great, by local standards, money. They lure them to Russia, then often lie to them saying that they are going to work inside Russia. When the Africans arrive, they are thrown to the front line in Ukraine. Some of them manage to call home and get in touch with journalists. They beg for help.
I'm begging my fellow Ghanaians to help us get out of here.
For example, in August of this year, citizens of the African state of Ghana came to Russia, where they were promised jobs as security guards at an agricultural enterprise. Immediately after their arrival in Russia, the men were taken to Kostroma and given labor contracts to sign, as they were told.
He told us, "Sign it, don't you trust me?"
The Africans signed it without even reading it because they don't understand a word in Russian. The paper turned out to be a contract for recruitment into the Russian army for the war in Ukraine. Then the men were transported to occupied Donetsk, and there they faced reality.
The commander told us that we were going to the front to fight in the war.
We wanted to escape, but we couldn't.
We can't go anywhere, not even to the restroom. The military follows us.
Many Africans accepted the fact that they found themselves at the front line, and some even knew from the very beginning where they were going, and Russians are making propaganda videos with them. So to say, they're fighting for Russia, but the only thing keeping them here is fear and the prospect of money. None of the Africans know Russian. The training turns into farce.
You touch boom! Hey, boom, all time finish.
These are the commanders of the Motorized Rifle Regiment 1307 of the Russian Armed Forces, complaining, saying that they have been reinforced with no one knows who.
We had a mixed group from all over the world, Bangladesh to Somalia. They are not really liked at the front. They are potential deserters. They are only pretentious until the first shelling. Russian commanders, primarily of mid-level, are extremely frustrated with natives of African countries. They are friendly to Russians. They smile, drink vodka together, eat pate and so on. But as soon as you have to go into battle, they just go numb and refuse to take part in the assaults.
But the Kremlin keeps luring foreigners. Here's how Syrian citizens are issued Russian passports.
I congratulate you on obtaining Russian citizenship. You all now have a Russian passport.
Then they were all sent to the front line. Putin signed a decree granting Russian citizenships for foreigners contracted to participate in the so-called SMO. The Russians are also recruiting representatives of Nepal, one of the poorest countries in the world. The same baits are being used.
They tell them you can make a lot of money, get a Russian passport and a lot of other things.
In Nepal, recruitment is a full-scale operation. Everyone is taken. According to the local authorities, the so-called recruiters have already managed to take 15,000 people to Russia. They all are being sent to the front line, that is, to be slaughtered. There are a lot of families of the dead here now, and they can't even get the bodies. Suman Rai is one of the very few mercenaries from Nepal who managed to escape from Russia and return to his homeland.
Russia is not interested in the seriously wounded. If a soldier was badly injured, we had to shoot him on the spot.
Citizens of Nepal flee from the Russian army as soon as they can get a chance, so they are put on the wanted list, although at the same time they continue to recruit new ones. Mercenaries are also being recruited in Latin America. Cuba is another country with desperate poverty. Men from here go to Russia en masse. In Havana, on almost every street there are families in which men have gone to war. This is the talk of the locals. Cuban recruits are calling their relatives.
We're here in Russia, near Tula. This is our camp. Those who come here, they know what they are doing. They come into war.
Then it's time for short training. And then they are sent to the front line. Here you can see Cuban turned into an artilleryman, but that's an exception. Most of them join the stormtroopers. They die in the first few weeks. Their families lose both money and breadwinner.
They are forced by poverty. If we didn't live in such poverty, I'm sure our men wouldn't go to Russia to earn money.
But propaganda and Putin assure that presidents of Africa, Asia and Latin America are going to war almost without self-interest, just to help their Russian brothers.
There are people who, on a voluntary basis, want, moreover, not for money, to come. We have to give them a hand and help them move to the combat zone.
It's hardly even a lie. It is more like the madman's nonsense. The fact that their citizens are being lured with money to be killed is well understood by the governments of Nepal, Cuba and other countries, and they oppose Russian agents. There have already been 17 people arrested in Cuba for recruiting the citizens to Russia.
The punishment for this crime is very serious. All the facts must be taken into account. It can be imprisonment for up to 30 years and lifelong imprisonment. The death penalty is also applicable.
The detainees' actions are regarded as mercenarism and human trafficking. Similarly, in Nepal, 20 recruiters were arrested. They were seized with bundles of currency, passports and forged documents. To combat Russian agents, the Nepalese government has created a special police unit to hunt down middlemen. They lure people with the help of social networks. Families of dead Nepalese hold demonstrations in front of the Russian embassy.
People are now demanding the return of the bodies of the dead from Russian authorities.
Russia is luring people out of India as well. The recruiters work in the poorest regions and they lie to people. This man here says his brother was promised a job at a transportation company. He believed it.
This picture shows my younger brother Ravi. The agent told us that he would send him to a good job with a salary. A few days later, my brother got in touch. We were shocked. He was wearing a Russian military uniform.
He was sent to the front in Ukraine, where he died. There are more than 100 such stories known to the Indian authorities. Putin has already raised the eye of the country's prime minister. At the talks in Moscow, Narendra Modi demanded the return of all Indian citizens recruited for the war. The Kremlin owner promised to terminate contracts with Indian fighting in Ukraine. It is not yet clear whether they have returned, but there is a chance that at least here Putin will fulfill his promise. After all, he is now very dependent on India and the money he gets from selling oil there. The Kremlin regime is actively recruiting Serbian citizens as well. The Russians are directly offering them to go to war. They don't lie to them about working as guards. But the Serbs who went to the front line also regret it after a while. They say they're treated like livestock, like expendable labor. They record video messages about it.
They gave us a rifle, but it had 2 magazines. We said we can't attack with 2 magazines, we can't storm the village, we need at least another grenade launcher, and the Russian commanders told us that you would get it for yourself in battle.
Former mercenary Dejan Beric also spoke about the attitude of Russians towards Serbs. He's an ardent supporter of Putin. He used to fight for the so-called DPR, then helped the Russians to recruit Serbian mercenaries. But even so, he cannot refrain from being outraged at what is now happening to Serbs on the front line in Ukraine.
They are treated like livestock in this 119th regiment. The command of this regiment is an organized crime group. After they refused to go to the assault, the commanders declared them deserters and war criminals. And representatives of military counterintelligence broke into the camp and beat the Serbian fighters with rifle butts.
Bullying of foreigners has become the norm for the Russian army. Many African citizens of Nepal and India dare to simply run with their hands up towards the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces during assaults. They surrender as prisoners of war. This is how the citizen of the African state of Sierra Leone, for example, managed to escape. Dirty Russian army uniform, frightened eyes, exhausted face. All this unites such people from different parts of the world. This is what a citizen of Nepal says about his experience in the Russian army.
We were treated like animals.
Africans were treated like slaves, that's what they say. All the hardest and nastiest work had to be done by dark-skinned men. And during attacks, they were pushed ahead of everyone else. The Russians stood behind and shot those who did not follow the order, which consisted of one simple English word.
The Russian commanders were just screaming to us, "Go, go, go!" That's the only word in English they know.
In English that I heard from them.
Sri Lanka citizens report being bitten.
We saw a Russian commander beating up a Sri Lankan. He came badly beaten with a swollen face, and I realized that they would beat me too if I refused to attack.
And here is a Cuban citizen describing how the foreigners were equipped.
I had neither a helmet nor body armor. That's what I was wearing, in a trench.
And the promise of huge payouts turned out to be scam.
I'm from Nepal. I had no money. That's why I joined the Russian army. They only paid me 4,000 rubles once for 1 month and 20 days. At first, they said they would pay me 195,000 rubles for 1 month, but they didn't.
In fact, all these statements by foreigners in the Russian army are very similar to Russian soldiers themselves. They have been recording the same appeals to Putin for a long time. They are also being deceived with money.
He cannot find money to pay servicemen, to help their families. We can't pay for utilities, for light or for gas. We want to know when Ulyanovsk mobilized soldiers will be paid.
They are also sent into an attack to be slaughtered.
Because of the criminal actions of our leadership, we are suffering heavy losses. They make us leave both the dead and wounded. Those who were wounded just bleed out. They are not evacuated. There are criminal orders to push forward the remnants of people under pain of death, threatening them with weapons.
Yurievich, a Russian military doctor who was awarded the title of a hero of the so-called SMO, says the same thing.
Serial killer of personnel under the guise of so-called meter souls has become a mass practice now. No fire cover, an hour to get ready. They are sent to die. Go in there and die. Well, that's how it is. That's not an assault. That's aggravated murder of people by a group of individuals with command by prior agreement.
Both Russians and foreign mercenaries are dying in these meat assaults, and Putin is still dreaming of soldiers who will go to die without any complaints, and he decided to buy them from Kim Jong-un. North Korea has sent Russia a live force that will be slaughtered in the same way. For the dictator of North Korea, people are less valuable than his dogs. Upon arrival in Russia, North Koreans are changed into Russian uniforms. They hand them their fake documents, trying to make them look like Buryats. This is an army of slaves who have only one right: the right to die.
With some assumption, one can state that they feel fiercely going to battle. Their families have become hostages. If the North Koreans surrender, their families are to be eliminated. There's a factor of influence on the battlefield. Putin is addressing the supply of cannon fodder, and Kim Jong-un, in any of that cannon fodder survives, gets sufficiently trained fighters who know how to fight.
Уцелеет из этого пушечного мяса, получает достаточно подготовленных бойцов, знающих, как вести боевые действия.
After all, the DPRK army has not fought a war for over 70 years. It has only participated in parades. Its level of training does not meet modern standards of warfare.
The Soviet Union, for example, had always treated North Korea with disdain, as a very little brother, a neglected child who is out there somewhere, dirty, unshaven, unwashed and unfed. And now it turns out that Putin, trying to restore the reputation of Russia to the level of the Soviet Union, is asking North Korea for help. It is triple humiliation, but Putin simply has no other option.
However, the cannon fodder received from various parts of the world will not change the situation on the battlefield dramatically for Russia. Modern warfare is a war of technology, and the language barrier is a huge problem.
Provided fire delay, provided fire support. If there are several language groups in one unit that have a poor command of a common language, that's trouble. It's a big problem. Sometimes mercenaries come from the same country, but they have completely different dialects, and they don't understand each other. And you have to try to figure out how to communicate with them.
Russia is massively mobilizing representatives of national minorities and also migrants, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Azerbaijanis. For this purpose, raids are carried out.
They are brought to military recruitment centers and they are deceived that signing a contract is some kind of an obligation to comply with immigration legislation. We have had cases when people were lied to directly at immigration centers. They had to sign a contract and bring a copy of this contract for the purposes of, for example, extending a residence permit or for obtaining a passport.
ВНЖ, вид на жительство, или там для получения паспорта.
Most of the professional army of the Russian Federation has long been killed at the front in Ukraine. Putin has to bet not on the quality of combat training, but on the quantity of soldiers. Everyone is being taken without consideration. Those Russians who are not distinguished by their intelligence are being taken as well. This man bet his friend a bottle of cognac that he would not be accepted into the army. He was sure that the armed forces of the Russian Federation did not need people like him with a bunch of diseases and alcoholic on top of it. When he came to sign the contract, he was definitely taken. Almost without training, he was sent to the front line. There he lost his limbs. Now he has no interest in cognac. He is in Ukrainian captivity.
Well, now that you think about it, it wasn't worth it, that bad. And now you're disabled.
Another source of replenishment for Putin's army is convicts. They are still being recruited en masse.
And we can already see that 53 prisons have closed because there are no prisoners. They all went to the front.
Thousands of criminals, including murderers, rapists, pedophiles, maniacs, are now part of Putin's army. This is no surprise to anyone. A cannibal and a murderer of girls have become best friends, fighting in Ukraine on the side of the Russian army. But this is not enough for Putin. He has now decided to establish complete permissiveness in Russia, to give people who have committed a crime the opportunity to escape the punishment. The owner of the Kremlin has signed the law authorizing the military contracts with the accused at this stage of legal proceedings, and so exempting them from criminal liability. Even a murderer caught in the act can say, "I'm ready to join the Russian army," and he will no longer be tried.
Now this right to go to war gives an indulgence from criminal responsibility from any act a person would commit.
Любого деяния, которое бы человек совершил.
The pre-trial detention centers are already preparing to send defendants to the front en masse, according to human rights activists.
They try to make the conditions in pretrial detention centers unbearable so that people decide to go to the war.
There are 100,000 people plus in Russian pre-trial detention centers. The authorities intend to recruit at least half of them.
That is probably over 50,000 people will go in a year.
In addition, Russian police officers have been instructed to recruit detainees before they get to the pre-trial detention centers. They are paid bonuses for this by their superiors.
10,000 is a bonus for police officers throughout Russia and 50,000 in Moscow for every one of these recruits.
The Russian army is gradually adding to the usual mobilized and contract soldiers a rattling mixture of criminals and sadists. The poorest people from all over the world who have been lured in by deceit or money are also being dragged in. At the same time, the propaganda screams about signing contracts and the promised payments continue to grow, except that there are fewer and fewer people willing. Those who did not want to go to die for Putin's imperial ambitions for 1 million rubles will not go to die for 2 million, and they will not go to die for 3 million. Raising the amount on billboards won't work.
I think that an average Russian who wants to make a lot of money very quickly, having signed a contract with the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, having found himself in a trench with an African, a North Korean, a cannibal, a pedophile and a maniacal rapist, will understand that in fact these ideas of the so-called operation, the glorification of everything, has, to put it mildly, taken a wrong turn somewhere.
Putin could stop putting Africans, migrants and criminals into his army and just start a second wave of mobilization, but now he is afraid to do so.
Putin fears that mobilization itself could lead to unrest, and unpredictable in fact, because even his court sociologists are constantly recording an increase in people's anxiety. Increased anxiety could eventually turn into what Pushkin wrote about, a senseless and merciless Russian revolt. They really fear it.
Protests have already taken place in Dagestan, Yakutia and other regions. The movement of wives of mobilized people is spreading more and more across Russia. A new wave of mobilization will mean that Putin will have to sacrifice sacred cows and start grabbing people en masse for war. In Moscow, St. Petersburg and other major cities, there will be many more dissatisfied people.
Multiply them by 100, by 1,000, there will be a movement in every region, which will create a wave, and further on it can follow an unpredictable trajectory. All this can start with those very mothers and wives of the mobilized, and further on it can go domino-like. For example, the Caucasus and the Volga region may protest.
So Putin can no longer now, as before, recruit soldiers wholesale. Now the dictator has to buy them at retail, searching all over the world for Africans, Asians and Latin Americans who are unfit for warfare. They are simply thrown into the attack as cannon fodder. The Russian army is now made up of a very diverse cast of characters. Those who do not go into attack for some mythical idea, they are driven by fear and the barrier troops behind them. And more Russians realize that promises of huge payments for signing a contract to participate in the war are a cheese in a mousetrap. They understand that they need to look for any opportunity to avoid mobilization, and that, for Putin, the life of a Russian citizen means no more than the life of a citizen of Cuba, Nepal or Somalia. Maxim Ulabov, Special Report.